Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be comparing three mini action cameras and we're going to try to figure out which is the best overall or which is the best choice for you. Stick around and let's try to find out. As small as action cameras are, there are still times when you would like to have something that's a little bit smaller and a little bit lighter. And that's where these guys come in, the mini action cameras. We have the new GoPro Hero 4K released just a few weeks ago. We have the Insta360 Go 3S, which was released back in June of this year. And we have the DJI Action 2, which is the oldest of the three that was actually released about 3 years ago. So today we're going to be comparing these three mini action cameras across multiple categories, looking at their features, capabilities, and yes, doing some testing in order to figure out which one is the best, or depending on your priority, which one is the right choice for you. So there's a lot to cover here, so as usual I'll place the chapters up here and on the video timeline, but before we get started, very important to emphasize this video is not sponsored, paid for, or influenced in any way. All of the products were purchased with my own money and the opinions are entirely my own. And please remember, if you enjoy the video, to give us a like and also consider subscribing to the channel for a lot more similar content. So let's get on with it. So this is how this is going to work. I'm going to compare the cameras across 8 different categories that I'll post up here, and for each of those categories I'm going to award 10 points. Now 2 of those categories I consider particularly important, so I'm going to double that to 20 points, and that will give us a total available score of up to 100 points. And obviously the camera with the most points at the end is, at least in my opinion, the best overall camera. However, it's important to emphasize that these are just my opinions. You may have a slightly different take for each category, and also depending on how you plan on using the camera, you may consider some categories way more important than others. And one final thing before we get to the comparison, I have not included price as a category. I just want to figure out first off which is the best overall camera, and then we'll discuss the pricing towards the end. So first up, we're going to look at the overall design and concept of the three cameras. And as you can see, each of the manufacturers has taken a very different approach when it comes to producing a mini action camera. So in this category, I'm going to start out with my third place pick, and that is the GoPro Hero. So clearly the concept behind the GoPro Hero is to have a scaled down and stripped down version of its bigger brother, the new Hero 13. But I feel that GoPro have gone a little bit too far when it comes to simplifying this product. It really is nothing beyond a point and shoot video camera with a touchscreen on the back, record button on the top, power button on the side, and as you can see, no front-facing screen for framing or seeing camera status when you're filming yourself. Now the Hero does have a built-in mount, but unlike on the Hero 13 where they introduced this very nice three-way mount consisting of a quick release, GoPro fingers, and a 1/4 tripod mount, the Hero just comes with the classic fold-out GoPro fingers. I think this is a bit of a disappointment. Second place in the design and concept category I'm giving to the DJI Action 2. Now the Action 2 is designed as a modular system, so the camera itself is this tiny little block here. It's all lens on the front, all touchscreen on the back. You have a single button on the top, and then on the bottom you have these terminals for connecting to the other modules of the system, including the one I have here, which provides an additional front-facing touchscreen. Now, as you can see, they attach magnetically, but there are also these locks here to keep it firmly in place once it's attached. The touchscreen module also includes a much larger battery for extending the runtime, and it also incorporates a USB-C port for charging and a micro SD card slot that we'll talk about later on. Now there is an alternative module which lacks the touchscreen. It is simply an extended battery. Obviously that is a less expensive option. So based on this modular type setup, this gives you the options to use the camera on its own and keep things nice and small, or particular with the screen module, you can then add this and use it more like a traditional action camera. Now, when it comes to mounting the Action 2, you have a number of options, including, of course, using the built-in magnets to simply stick it to a suitable surface and, of course, point it in any direction. You can also use this handy helper magnet that comes supplied, which allows you to place it facing outward from a magnetic surface. But of course, when you do that, you do need to take a little bit of care to be sure to not damage the touchscreen. And also the Action 2 comes supplied with a number of quick release mounts. You have the classic finger style mount. You have this pivot stand, which can be stuck to pretty much any flat surface. And you have this pendant style mount, which can be placed behind clothing in order to get a good first person type view. And all of these mounting systems also work together with the additional modules attached. But the clear winner for me when it comes to design and concept is the Insta360 Go 3S. Now, like DJI, Insta360 has gone with a modular approach, but the implementation is a little bit different. When you buy the Go 3S, you get this module also called the Action Pod, and the camera, of course, can be removed from the Action Pod and used independently, or placed in the Action Pod and used much more like a traditional action camera. Of course, you have a touchscreen on the back, which is much larger than on the other two, and in case you're wondering about the lack of a front-facing touchscreen, that rear screen actually flips up and allows you to also view it from the front. And it has an additional trick up its sleeve, and that is if you remove the camera, the screen continues to connect to the camera now wirelessly and allows you to use it as a remote for the camera. Now, when it comes to mounting the Go 3S, you can make use of the built-in magnets to place it on any suitable surface, although only facing outwards. But Insta360 makes sure you have plenty of other options, including this handy mount, which allows you to clip it onto a cap or a strap of a backpack, and then position this at any angle to get the shot you desire. They also provide this very easy to use pendant for attaching the camera, and you can even attach this clip to the pendant and also position the camera any way you want. Insta360 also provides a pivot stand which allows you to quickly connect the camera, stick this to any surface, and position the camera in any way you need. And just like with DJI, it's also worth mentioning that all these quick release devices work with the camera in the Action Pod also. Now, there is one little thing that prevents me from giving the Go 3S a perfect score here, and that is when the camera is out of the Action Pod, the button to power on and start recording is basically the face of the camera. So simply pressing on the face of the camera, particularly if you have the quick capture enabled, will start recording. And if you have the camera out of the Action Pod, it is extremely easy to start this by accident. And on a number of occasions, I have ended up with 10 minutes worth of recording of the inside of my pocket or a bag, and of course my battery gets drained in the process. So when it comes to the overall design and concept, I'm awarding 5 out of 10 to the GoPro Hero, 7 out of 10 to the DJI Action 2, and 9 out of 10 to the Insta360 Go 3S. Next up, let's talk about the size and weight, or basically just how mini these mini action cameras can be. Now for this category, I'm awarding double points because let's face it, this is one of the main reasons that you're buying one of these mini action cameras as opposed to one of the larger alternatives. Now when it comes to the overall size, rather than throw numbers at you, I think this visual basically sums it up. As you can see, the Go 3S is by far the smallest and the GoPro Hero is the largest. As far as the weights are concerned, the Go 3S comes in at 39 grams, the Action 2 a little heavier at 56 grams, and the GoPro Hero the heaviest at 86 grams. Now, it is important to consider that often you will need to add a mount to these cameras. Now, in the case of the Hero, of course, the mount is already incorporated into the camera, whereas in the case of the other two, this is going to add to their size and weight. And if we add a mount to each of them, as you can see, the difference is no longer so great. But clearly when you consider the flexibility of placement, the Action 2 is going to get you into much smaller spaces than the GoPro Hero, and the Go 3S is going to get you into even smaller spaces than either of these two. So in this category, once again, for me, the Go 3S takes first place. So for the size and weight category, I'm awarding 7 points to the GoPro Hero, 8 points to the Action 2, and the full 10 points to the Go 3S. And as I mentioned, this is a double points category, so we're going to double those points and add them to our running total. Next up, let's talk about ruggedness or action readiness. So basically, how much punishment can each of these cameras take? Now, third place in this category I'm giving to the DJI Action 2 for two main reasons. Firstly, that when you look at the front and the back, the front is all lens, the back is all touchscreen, and I just feel the slightest knock is very likely to impact one of these two pretty fragile components. Now, the Action 2 does come with this protective case, which does of course make the whole camera slightly larger and heavier, but it does provide additional protection by providing a small raised lip around the lens and also on the rear screen. But the main reason I'm marking this one down is because unlike the other two, it does not have a lens protector. So if this element is to get scratched or otherwise damaged, you basically have to replace the entire camera. Second place in ruggedness goes to the GoPro. Now it too has a touchscreen on the back, but I just feel it seems a little bit better protected. And also turning to the front, the lens is protected by a removable lens guard. So if this were to get scratched or damaged, this can be replaced at relatively low cost. And once again, in first place, I'm going to give this one to the Go 3S. I think its super light and small design lends to it not getting damaged very easily. Like the GoPro, it also has a removable lens protector. But the main reason this is coming out on top of the GoPro is that the GoPro is waterproof to 5 meters, whereas the Go 3S is waterproof down to 10 meters. So for the ruggedness category, it's 9 points I'm awarding to the GoPro Hero, 7 points to the DJI Action 2, and again the full 10 points going to the Insta360 Go 3S. So when it comes to features and capabilities, the way I'm looking at this is comparing to a full-size action camera and looking at what you have to sacrifice in order to get the small size. So in third place when it comes to features and capabilities is the GoPro Hero, because there are a lot of sacrifices here. When it comes to the modes, you just get the three basics, which is standard video at either 4K or 1080p at 30 frames per second. You get what is laughably called a slow motion mode, which is 1080p at up to 60 frames per second. And of course you get still photo mode. Apart from that, you don't get any of the modes that you are familiar with from most action cameras. There's no time-lapse mode, there's no true slow motion mode, there's no pre-recording, loop recording, interval recording, none of these, just the 3 basic modes. And worse still, within the modes that you do have, you have absolutely no control over the settings. You cannot adjust the exposure, you cannot adjust the white balance, the color, the field of view. Nothing is available. You can only shoot with fully automatic settings. Now, one thing I think they did do right when it comes to the features is by recording directly to a removable memory card. So if you are on a trip, if you are out shooting and you are running out of memory on one card, of course, you can just simply swap it out with another card. But as I mentioned earlier on, the Hero is clearly designed as a very basic, very simple camera, and frankly, I think GoPro have gone a little bit too far with that. In second place, I'm going with the Go 3S. Now, when it comes to the different recording modes, the Go 3S offers pretty much everything that you could possibly want. Standard video, slow motion up to 200 frames per second. You have time-lapse mode, interval mode, loop recording mode, pretty much anything you would normally have on an action camera. And yes, you have full access to the settings, so you can change the exposure, the white balance, the color, and so on. Now, where the Go 3S lacks a little bit is in its overall performance. So 4K is limited to only 30 frames per second. And also in the slow motion modes, you have to drop down to 2.7K if you want 100 frames per second and 1080p if you want 200 frames per second. And one other thing that's missing on the Go 3S is the ability to add any kind of external microphone, either USB or Bluetooth. But in first place, when it comes to features and capabilities, I'm going with the Action 2. As far as the modes are concerned, I would say technically the Go 3S might have 1 or 2 more modes, but the Action 2 definitely has all the modes you would typically find in an action camera and all the modes you basically need. But I think the Action 2 really scores because it is more geared towards the serious creator. It has the largest sensor of all 3 cameras. You have full control over all of your modes, including a flat color profile for grading in post. You have much higher frame rates, so you can do 4K at 120 frames per second, including sound. You can do slow motion 4K, or you can do slow motion 1080p at up to 240 frames per second. And one other thing that the Action 2 offers that the others don't is by adding the screen module or the battery module, this allows you to add an external USB microphone. And if that external microphone is the DJI mic or DJI Mic 2, not only does that give you 2 wireless microphones, but also the wireless microphones can act as a remote to start and stop recording. Now, the Action 2 does also offer the ability to write direct to a memory card, but only in this configuration when you have the screen module or the battery module attached. When it is in the standalone camera mode, obviously that is no longer an option. So when it comes to features and capabilities, I'm giving 5 points to the GoPro Hero, 9 points to the Action 2, and 8 points to the Go 3S. So operation was a difficult one to judge, but in the end I've decided to give third place to the GoPro Hero. Now, all 3 cameras are operated by a combination of 1 or 2 buttons together with a touchscreen interface, but frankly I've always found that GoPro's touchscreen interface has lagged behind that of DJI and Insta360, and the Hero is no different. Very often as you're swiping through options, it sticks on one and you have to wait for it to confirm before you can move to the other one. It's just not very responsive. Also, coming back to that theme of oversimplification, I just find there's not much you can do on the touchscreen other than change modes. In second place is the Go 3S. Now, when it comes to operating the camera using the Action Pod, the interface and the operation is every bit as good as the DJI, but of course the Go 3S has one weakness, and that is as soon as you pull the camera out of the Action Pod, you no longer have your touchscreen interface. Now, in this situation, that puts it at a disadvantage to the GoPro Hero, but frankly, apart from being able to frame your shot, as I said before, the touchscreen on the GoPro Hero really doesn't offer you any benefit. Using the single button on the Go3S, I can power on and off the camera, and I can start and stop recording in one of two selected modes. And the fact that the interface is so much better when it's in the Action Pod leads me to rank it higher than the GoPro Hero. But the winner for me in the operation category is the DJI Action 2. Now, as I said a moment ago, the touchscreen interfaces on the DJI and the Insta360 are basically equivalent. Both are extremely good. The difference being that on the Action 2, I have that touchscreen available at all times, even in the smallest configuration. And in addition to that, the touchscreens used on the Action 2 are higher quality OLED screens, which make them easier to view in bright lighting conditions. So when it comes to scoring in the operation category, I'm giving 7 points to the GoPro Hero, the full 10 points to the DJI Action 2, and 8 points to the Insta360 Go3S. Next up, let's talk about battery life and endurance. Now, before we get into the rankings, there's a couple of things worth pointing out here. Firstly, all of the numbers I'm giving you here are not manufacturer's specifications. They are based on my own testing, and all my testing is done at 4K 30 frames per second. Second, it's important to point out that for all three of these cameras, they have fixed batteries. So you cannot replace the battery in any of these cameras. So that means when you drain the battery, you cannot simply replace it with another one. You have to plug it in and recharge it and wait in order to be able to start recording again. So in third place in the battery and endurance category is the Insta360 Go3S. Now in this configuration in the Action Pod, you can record longer than the other two, actually over 2 hours at 4K, but the main emphasis of this comparison test is of course of the mini cameras. And when you take the camera out and operate it standalone, you get just over half an hour, about 32 minutes worth of 4K recording time. Now recharge time is also around about that 32-minute mark, so you're basically looking at recording for half an hour and then recharging for half an hour. Now, of course, if you have the Action Pod with you, you can be recharging your camera between recordings. But bottom line, if you're operating the camera standalone, the best you're going to get is about half an hour's worth of recording time. In second place, I have the Action 2. Now here, if you combine it with the screen module, you'll get around about 90 minutes of recording time of 4K. I believe the battery-only module would give you slightly longer than that, but of course our emphasis is just on the camera itself, and with the camera itself you get around 40 minutes of 4K recording. Now in the initial tests I did, I was actually having more problem with overheating than with battery life, getting only around about 12 to 15 minutes of recording time before the camera overheated. But thankfully DJI came up with this heat dissipating case, which also of course protects the camera. And with the case installed, I'm able to run for the full 40 minutes without any overheating problems. Now, recharging the Action 2 is actually much more efficient than the other two. You can be back up to 80% in just 17 minutes or back to 100% within 25 minutes. So you'll have to wait a little bit less between recordings. And in first place in the battery and endurance category is the GoPro Hero. Now in my testing, I was able to record for a pretty impressive 86 minutes in 4K. Recharging isn't the fastest. You can recharge to 80% in about half an hour and the rest of the way to 100% in about an hour, which is pretty slow. But the bottom line here is clearly the Hero is going to give you the longest duration without having to recharge. So in terms of points for battery and endurance, I'm giving 8 points to the GoPro Hero, 6 points to the Action 2, and 5 points to the Go3S. Next up, let's talk about the post-recording workflow. And what I mean by this is how fast and easy is it to get your recordings off the camera, share them with your friends and family, post them online, or bring them into your editing software. Now, of course, there are two main ways of doing this. The first being transferring them wirelessly over to your smartphone using the respective app. and the other way being to transfer the files over to your desktop or laptop in order to be able to bring them into your video editing software. Now, in third place in this category is the GoPro Hero. Now, probably the biggest issue with the GoPro Hero in this regard is the fact that there is no in-camera stabilization. So in order to get stabilized footage, you first have to process your files through the GoPro Quick app, either on your smartphone or on your computer. Now, if you typically use the smartphone app, that probably won't be that big a deal because you're going through that process anyway, although the transfer time for the GoPro is extremely slow at just 15 megabytes per second, which, just to put it in perspective, means that a 5-minute recording is going to take somewhere around 2 to 2.5 minutes to upload to your smartphone. Now, if like me, you typically do your editing on a desktop or laptop, that is where it gets particularly bad with the GoPro. Once again, if you want stabilized footage, you first have to run it through the GoPro Quick app. And if you are a Windows user, you are out of luck because currently there is no GoPro Quick app for Windows. But assuming you have a Mac, you would think that you could simply plug in your camera using the USB-C port and transfer the files over, but you'll find that doesn't work either because the USB-C port is only there for charging. But of course you can remove the SD card and put it into a card reader and transfer the files over that way. But once again, you have to run them through the GoPro Quick app if you want your files to be stabilized. This involves importing them into the Quick app and then exporting out a stabilized version of the same file. So it's very time consuming, you end up with multiple versions of the same file, and it's just an overly complex process. And one other thing to mention regarding the post-recording workflow on the GoPro is, if you remember from earlier, you have no control over the recording settings, so very often you're going to have to go in and edit things like exposure, color, field of view, and so on, which means a lot of extra work, and this could so easily have been avoided if GoPro had just given us access to these settings on the camera. In second place for the post-recording workflow is the DJI Action 2. Now, if you typically upload files using your smartphone, then I would say there's not a lot of difference between the DJI and the GoPro. The apps are quite similar, and both cameras transfer files to the app at a similarly slow speed. But where the DJI wins out over the GoPro is when it comes to editing using a desktop or laptop. Obviously, the files on the DJI are already stabilized in camera, and they can simply be transferred into whatever video editing software you want to use. As far as the transfer is concerned, you can plug in the USB-C port on the screen or battery module. It transfers at 30 megabytes per second. You can also transfer the files from the internal memory of the camera to a memory card in the screen or battery module, and then of course transfer those over using any memory card reader. But in first place in this category is the Go 3S, narrowly edging out the DJI. Firstly, when it comes to the smartphone transfer, it uses the same slow 15 megabyte per second transfer rate as the other two, but I think most people would agree that the Insta360 app is much more powerful and intuitive than the other two. And when it comes to transferring the files to a desktop or laptop editing application, here too, just like the DJI, all your recordings are already stabilized in camera, so you can transfer them to whatever video editing software you want to use. And the Go 3S also offers a very slight edge, being able to transfer the files at around 40 megabytes per second versus 30 megabytes per second on the DJI. So in our workflow category, I'm giving 4 points to the GoPro Hero, 6 points to the Action 2, and 7 points to the Go 3S. And our final and perhaps the most important category is the video quality. So in these tests, all cameras were set to 4K 30 frames per second, and all other settings were placed to completely automatic. So, see what you think. Okay, so let's start out with some basic inside filming. This is a standard lit interior room, no special lighting of any kind. I have the GoPro Hero on your left, I have the Action 2 in the middle, and I have the Go 3S on your right. So how does the video quality compare between the three? I have stabilization, of course, turned off on all three right now, and all are recording at 4K 30 frames per second. And let's just also turn our attention briefly to the audio. So up to this point, you've been listening to me on the onboard microphones of the Go 3S. Let's switch over to the Action 2 and hear the quality of the sound on the onboard microphones of the DJI Action 2. And let's also now switch over to the GoPro Hero to hear the audio quality from the onboard microphones of the GoPro Hero. Okay, so now I have turned on some studio lighting. I am being lit from the side here by a pretty powerful studio light and a little bit of fill lighting coming also from the other side. So how does that now compare between the three? Presumably I should be pretty well exposed and the background should be a little bit darker now, and possibly you may be able to see some increased noise in the shadows and in the background. But again, how does this compare between the GoPro Hero on the left, the Action 2 in the middle, and the Go 3S on your right? Okay, let's do some walking and talking. I have the GoPro Hero on your left, the Action 2 in the middle, and the Go 3S on the right. What do you think of the video quality between the three? Now, because I'm walking, of course, I have stabilization turned on, and on the GoPro we applied stabilization using the Quick app. So what do you think of the video quality here in amongst the trees? This is a particularly challenging environment to film in. Are you seeing any digital artifacts in those trees behind me as the stabilization is working? And while we're here, let's do an audio comparison as well. So far you've been listening to me on the onboard microphones of the Hero. Let's switch over to the Action 2 and compare the audio quality on the Action 2, and let's switch over to the Go 3S and listen to its onboard microphones also. How do they compare with each other, and of course how does the video quality compare? And let's just do a little bit of B-roll as I scan around in amongst the trees here so we can get an idea of the video quality between the three. Maybe if I also break into a run just to see how well the stabilization works. So having been through these clips multiple times, from my perspective it seems pretty clear that the Go 3S provides the best overall image quality. I found the Go 3S image to be sharper with more detail, and I thought it did a particularly good job in the different indoor lighting scenes. In fact, in those tests it actually performed better than some larger action cameras that I've tested. As far as the GoPro is concerned, I think indoors it did a pretty poor job overall, which I'm sure is due to the fact that it has the smallest sensor of the three, but outdoors I think it did a pretty good job. And then there's the Action 2, which, considering that it has the largest sensor of the three and the highest specifications, overall I was a little bit disappointed, but I guess this is more a case of the Action 2 showing its age at this point. Now, I do think it's important to remind you that all of these tests were done using fully automatic settings. Obviously on the GoPro we have no choice, but clearly on the Action 2 and the Go 3S you would have the ability to go into the settings and try to optimize your image quality further. So what about the points? Well, as I mentioned earlier, this is a double points category and I will assign those double points directly. So I'm giving 13 points to the GoPro, also 13 points to the Action 2 and 16 points to the Go 3S. And if we add those to our running total, that means we have in first place the Insta360 Go 3S with a score of 83 points. In second place, the DJI Action 2 with a score of 74 points. And in third place, the GoPro Hero with a score of 65 points. So we have our first, second and third place rankings, but one thing we have not discussed up to this point is pricing. And not unexpectedly, it seems that we have proven the old adage that you get what you pay for. The first place Go 3S starts at around $400. The second place DJI Action 2 comes in at $275. And the third place GoPro Hero comes in at just under $200. So is the Go 3S really worth double the price of the GoPro Hero, or depending on your situation, which is the right camera for you? Well, from my perspective, clearly the Go 3S is the best camera of the three, and if your budget stretches to it, then that's the one you should go for. That being said, in certain situations, the GoPro Hero might just be a good option for you. That situation being, if you do most of your sharing and editing using the smartphone app, if you do most of your filming outdoors in nice bright lighting, and you don't mind the extra size and weight of the GoPro, it may be a good choice because under those circumstances it can give you pretty decent results. As for the Action 2, yes, it holds its own in this comparison testing, but there's no question it's definitely showing its age now, and let's hope that DJI give us a successor to the Action 2 in a not too distant future. So that's a wrap for another video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed our video. If so, please remember to give us a like and consider subscribing to the channel. Also, if you have any comments, any questions, if you have any suggestions for future videos, please drop those into the comments section. Otherwise, thanks again for watching.